Solomon stands as one of history's most iconic monarchs, a ruler of unparalleled prosperity and one of the wealthiest individuals the world has ever known. In biblical accounts, he is prominently featured not only as the successor to his father King David on the throne of Israel, but also for his extraordinary wisdom and remarkable achievements, chief among them the construction of the first temple in Jerusalem. To illustrate his significance, while Solomon isn't mentioned in the biblical narrative until David's final days are recorded, his name subsequently appears approximately 300 times in the Old Testament alone, and at least 12 times in the New Testament, beyond biblical texts. Solomon's name also surfaces in other non-canonical writings, and is interwoven with Jewish legends that, intriguingly, link him to mystical and even esoteric practices, such as the supposed control over demons. However, in this video, we will delve into the authentic history of Solomon as presented in the Bible. King Solomon was the son of David and Bathsheba, the former wife of Uriah. Thus, Solomon was born during David's reign from Jerusalem. He is also known in the Bible by the name Jedediah, meaning beloved of the Lord. King Solomon's reign over Israel spanned approximately 40 years, from around 971 to 931 BCE. There is virtually no information regarding Solomon's early life or youth. However, considering the biblical details about David's family life, we can infer the environment in which Solomon grew up. David had multiple wives, which inevitably led to numerous conflicts among his spouses and children, who engaged in various intrigues, often in pursuit of prestige and power. Indeed, Solomon himself emerges in the biblical narrative amidst significant tension within the royal family, during a struggle for the throne of Israel, as King David was old and frail. Prior to this, Absalom, Solomon's half-brother, had already attempted to usurp his father's throne but failed. However, sometime later, David's eldest surviving son, tried to replicate Absalom's move, proclaiming himself king over Israel. Adonijah even secured the support of Joab, David's former general, and Abiathar the priest, and made every effort to seize his father's throne, even holding a coronation feast. Upon learning of Adonijah's scheme, Bathsheba, the prophet Nathan Zadok, the priest, and other allies worked to remind David of his unfulfilled promise regarding Solomon, that he would be his successor. Consequently, David issued orders for Solomon's ascension to the throne, and he was crowned king of Israel, anointed by Zadok. It is likely that King Solomon was no older than 18 when he was crowned. Solomon's reign was extensive, lasting for decades, though scholars debate whether his period of rule was approximately between 971 and 931 BCE, or between 960 and 920 BCE, with the former being more probable. Immediately after David's death, King Solomon followed his father's instructions and acted decisively to solidify his position as king and dismantle any opposition. He ordered the deaths of Adonijah and Joab and the banishment of Abiathar, thus beginning his reign without internal opposition. King Solomon inherited a vast territory from David, spanning approximately 128,000 square kilometers. During his reign, Solomon significantly improved Israel's domestic conditions. He replaced the ancient tribal divisions with the division of his territory into 12 administrative districts, each overseen by a royal commissioner. These districts were responsible for providing sustenance for the court throughout the year, with each district supplying provisions for 1 month. The daily provisions list was quite substantial, and according to 1 Kings chapter 4, it included 9,000 kilograms of flour, 30 oxen, 100 sheep and rams, as well as deer, gazelle, and well-fed fowl, which served as table delicacies. Many consider these quantities fantastical, but they overlook that these provisions were intended for the entire court of Israel, at its peak, likely including all officials, servants, and King Solomon's extended family. Many scholars believe this quantity likely fed over 12,000 people daily. King Solomon's court was highly organized and comprehensive, with his government assistants referred to as princes. In the military sphere, King Solomon also implemented significant improvements. He introduced chariots and cavalry into his army. He also developed new roads and established border fortresses to safeguard trade routes. Speaking of trade, commercial activity was a cornerstone of Solomon's reign. He controlled trade routes and organized strategic operational points that generated immense revenue, making silver as common in his kingdom as stones and cedar, leading him to live amidst an unprecedented splendor of wealth in Israel. Furthermore, he was a skilled diplomat, and throughout his reign, Israel rarely had to contend with foreign military threats. Solomon's first significant commercial agreement was with Hiram, king of Tyre, to whom he annually paid the equivalent of 2,000 tons of wheat and 400,000 liters of pure olive oil in exchange for timber and stonemasons for his constructions. King Solomon also forged a contract with Egyptian merchants for the trade of horses and chariots, which he, in turn, exported to the Hittites and Syrians. Naturally, yielding substantial profit, the most lucrative commercial endeavor for King Solomon was his maritime trade. With his ships sailing the Red Sea and the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean, reaching as far as Ophir, these voyages could last up to 3 years. Considering the annual revenue from his commercial strategies, the fees received for goods traffic, and the taxes paid by the population across his controlled territory, the estimated sum of his wealth reaches an exceptional level, positioning King Solomon as one of the wealthiest individuals in human history. Of all the constructions undertaken during King Solomon's reign, the temple in Jerusalem was undoubtedly the most significant. In accordance with God's promise, King Solomon executed his father's project to build a temple to house the Ark of the Covenant. To secure the necessary labor, King Solomon resorted to forced labor, particularly from Canaanite peoples subjugated by Israel. However, the number of Canaanite workers was insufficient for his plans. Consequently, he conscripted Israelites for this task, also subjecting them to a form of forced labor. This measure was, predictably, quite unpopular. This fact was evident in the episode of Adoniram's death. The superintendent of the labor groups, the temple built by Solomon was located on Mount Moriah, the place where King David had erected an altar to the Lord, and, before that, likely where Abraham would have ascended with Isaac for sacrifice. Despite David having collected materials for the temple's construction, it was only in the 4th year of Solomon's reign that its building commenced. Even appearing modest in size by current standards, the temple building represented a grand undertaking at the time, constructed with the most valuable materials, including tons of gold and noble woods. Upon completing the temple's construction in the 11th year of his reign, King Solomon planned a grand celebration, where many sacrifices were offered during the dedication of the edifice. Among the other structures built by King Solomon in Israel, we can highlight the House of the Forest of Lebanon, which was 50 meters long, 25 meters wide, and 15 meters high. A portico of columns measuring 25 by 15 meters, a hall for his throne, where he conducted judgments, a house for the daughter of the Pharaoh of Egypt, one of his wives, whose location possessed impressive grandeur. And Solomon's own residence must have been a considerable construction, where he accommodated 700 wives and 300 concubines, in addition to the necessary servants. Furthermore, Solomon also built Miloah, a massive fortress to protect the temple. As we know, beyond wealth, King Solomon was renowned for his wisdom. In the Bible, we read the account of King Solomon's dream, where the Lord appeared to him and asked what he most desired to receive. Solomon could have asked for riches, longevity, or honor. However, the young king requested wisdom. He asked for an understanding heart, to govern his people prudently. One of the biblical episodes that most highlights King Solomon's wisdom is when 2 mothers appeared before him, disputing a single newborn. The case was quite challenging, as there were no witnesses, but with great wisdom, King Solomon proposed that the child be divided into 2 parts to resolve the issue. Faced with the possibility of her son's death, the true mother preferred to surrender the child to the impostor woman, and this led Solomon to judge the case impeccably. King Solomon's wisdom can also be perceived throughout the literature he produced. Solomon composed thousands of proverbs and songs, and the depth of his proverbs is also impressive, with the Bible reporting that he discoursed on trees, animals, birds, reptiles, and fish. In addition to biblical accounts, many ancient legends and documents refer to Solomon's spectacular wisdom. Among the books of the Bible, Solomon is attributed with the authorship of a large part of the book of Proverbs, as well as Ecclesiastes, perhaps the Song of Solomon, and at least Psalms 72 and 127. The Bible also states that Solomon's wisdom was so impressive that people from all nations and kings of the earth came to hear his wisdom. One such visit was made by the Queen of Sheba, who came from the ends of the earth to personally hear King Solomon's wisdom. The Queen of Sheba posed many questions and riddles to Solomon, and the king intelligently answered all her inquiries, leaving her completely impressed. On that occasion, the Queen of Sheba presented Solomon with many gifts, including over 4 tons of gold. Despite all his wisdom, King Solomon made decisions that brought him significant problems. For example, Solomon subjected the people to forced labor. His international commercial practices somehow led to idolatry entering Israel through contact with other peoples. He imposed a heavy tax burden that oppressed the Israelites. There was also his intense polygamy, which was the primary means by which false gods began to be recognized in Hebrew territory. Indeed, Solomon himself was influenced by his many foreign wives, and in his old age, he practiced mixed worship, following other gods. Regarding Solomon's marital life, everything indicates that marriage was part of his political maneuvers. In other words, it seems Solomon used his marriages to secure advantageous international agreements. Although it is also true that the biblical text records that Solomon loved his wives, indicating that his relationships were not solely for strategic advantages. Be that as it may, Solomon reached the impressive number of 700 wives, in addition to 300 concubines. He was the Israelite ruler who most disregarded the biblical ordinance that a king in Israel should not have many wives, lest his heart turn away from the Lord. Among King Solomon's wives was the daughter of the Pharaoh of Egypt, and upon this union, Solomon received the city of Gezer as a dowry. Some Arab, Jewish, and Ethiopian traditions suggest that Solomon also had a romantic relationship with the Queen of Sheba, from which a son was supposedly born, Menelik, the founder of the Ethiopian royal house. However, the Bible does not report anything about this. Solomon's heir Rehoboam was born from his marriage to Naamah, an Ammonite woman. Reconsidering the period of Solomon's reign, 40 years, and the age of his son, Rehoboam, when he succeeded, 41 years, we can conclude that Solomon's relationship with Naamah began before his reign. Therefore, many scholars believe that Naamah may have been Solomon's first wife. But King Solomon's grave sin, in affronting the worship of God in Israel, when he began to follow other gods to satisfy his foreign wives, could not go unpunished. The Bible says that God was indignant with Solomon. The truth is that the king, best known for his wisdom and unimaginable riches, also experienced decline and consequent divine disapproval because, ironically, he was not wise in the things of God and disregarded his ordinances. However, in his mercy and love for David, God suspended his full judgment during Solomon's lifetime and did not take the kingdom from him. Nevertheless, even with the postponement of divine judgment during his life, Solomon experienced threats from enemies raised by God to be instruments of judgment in his kingdom, such as Hadad the Edomite, Rezon the Aramean. Among these three adversaries, Jeroboam holds the most prominence in the biblical text. He was a strong and hard-working leader who rebelled against King Solomon's policies, and during Rehoboam's reign, he divided the kingdom of Israel and became king of the northern tribes. Therefore, after Solomon's death, divine punishment was indeed poured out upon his house, and the glorious unified kingdom of Israel was taken from his son. The Bible does not provide details about how Solomon died. What is known is that he ended his life melancholically, leaving a worn-out kingdom on the verge of collapse. But, undoubtedly, he made extremely important contributions to Israel. Solomon was the king who built the temple of the Lord, the king who consolidated Israel on the international stage of his time, and the foremost exponent of Hebrew wisdom literature. Regarding the many extra-biblical stories about Solomon, there is no evidence that they are true. Yes, indeed, the Bible itself mentions the existence of records about Solomon. Some of these records, such as the one titled The Book of the History of Solomon, served as sources for the biblical writer of the books of 1 Kings and 2 Kings. However, these materials have been lost. That is, they no longer exist. What remains today are merely legends and fanciful writings, produced primarily by adherents of a more mystical branch of later Judaism. In these legends, Solomon is often portrayed as someone involved with magic, capable of controlling demons, and even conversing with animals. But these accounts are generally based on pseudepigraphical writings of unknown authorship, likely produced in the medieval period. Unfortunately, many uninformed people prefer to believe in the veracity of these false works, and reject what is actually recorded in the biblical text, which, whether people like it or not, is the most well-documented work in history. It is even common for some people to say that the true story of Solomon was hidden. If you've made it this far, like and subscribe to our channel. If you haven't already, comment and share the video. And don't forget to activate the notification bell. See you in the next study.